Dr. Daniel Cash is going to deep dive into reforming credit practice, credit rating practices globally. And Dr. Cash's presentation is based on his paper titled Rating the Globe, Reforming Credit Rating Agencies for an Equitable Financial Architecture. And it promises to offer fresh insights into creating a more balanced ecosystem. Ladies and finally, we have Dr. Daniel Cash on the line.
It's great to see you this morning, and I hope to do it justice after these technical difficulties. I would like to share my screen, but I'm conscious that I don't want to make things go even worse. So we'll try to share my screen because it would be great to share with you the paper as we go through it, just to show you some of the things that I would like to talk about. So hopefully you are seeing my screen. Okay, so if that's the case, I'll go through the paper. This paper was requested by the United Nations University, of which I'm a senior fellow, to supplement a paper that the director David Passarelli and Patricia Justino were creating that was looking at the requests of the Global South in terms of international financial architecture reform. So with that in mind, we designed a credit rating paper that really sought to provide insight into why there was a lack of development in credit rating reform and to understand where the best pathways may be in moving forward with credit rating reform. So our paper really starts with obviously an executive summary, but then we move into an introduction into understanding credit ratings and their impact on the global scene. Now, one of the things that is really central to this paper is the concept that the environment around the global south, and particularly around African countries, has rapidly changed over the past 10, 20 years. So what we show here is the changing nature of debt on the continent in terms of the financing landscape. And what you can see is that since 1990, moving towards 2024, the private creditor is becoming ever more dominant on the creditor landscape. The changing nature of that creditor landscape really makes it, excuse me, a really different landscape in terms of traditional debt treatment programs. What we do is we move forward, and I'll come back to this box in a moment, but as you can see in this box, this is the changing nature of debt on the African landscape. And what you see is that multilateral creditors and bilateral creditors are moving back. We see a marked reduction in ODA, official development assistance. And there are numerous examples of African countries, particularly being encouraged and promoted to enter into the capital market. And we see that in the early 2000s. There's a famous speech by then US Secretary Colin Powell, where he calls it a golden ticket for African countries to enter the capital markets. We see in 2002 UNDP supervise and facilitate the credit rating agencies essentially entering the continent, and they essentially paid for Standard & Poor's to initially rate 13, 14 African countries. All of that is in a backdrop of a lessening of support by bilateral traditional lenders to the continent, like the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Germany, and what have you. This push towards the private creditors for this paper is central because the world and the system in which private creditors operate is very different, and it provides very different things. So the first thing I would want to note that we talk about in the paper is an introduction to sovereign bonds. So we look at euro bonds specifically. Euro bonds have a particular system in place in how they are offered and issued into the capital markets. And one thing that often goes unrecognized is that we hear quite often that a credit rating is responsible for setting the rate at which a country pays back its debt. And in actual fact, that's not technically true. The credit rating agencies are one component of a larger system that sets the rate. So, for example, we were working recently with Kenyan authorities, and a lot of the questions we got asked were, why is our debt being sold at maybe 9, 10% interest rate, but it's 6, 7, 8 times oversubscribed? One of the reasons that's put forward is that the credit ratings are so low, but the real reason, unfortunately, is that you have a number of what we call arrangers, but they're essentially investment banks, and they're the ones who are setting the rates particularly low so that they can push through the euro bond and receive their essentially their fees on that sale. So what we try to push in this paper is a wider understanding of the whole system to show that whilst credit ratings are absolutely critical, there is a larger system at play, and we have to reconsider how we look at that whole system. So the paper provides a background in how credit rating agencies work. As the CEO mentioned, there are different factors for different credit ratings in how they consider sovereign debt. And here we break it down through Fitch, Moody's, and S&P's different elements that they look at. But they usually look at economic and fiscal assessments in priority, and then add in, as the CEO mentioned, in terms of things like quantitative and qualitative overlays. However, as I mentioned, the paper really looks at the role of credit rating agent of private creditors, and to do that, we also look at the growing call for credit rating reform on the international scene. So, in supplementation to what's coming out of Africa in terms of the countries who are raising this issue, and also initiatives like the Africa Peer Review Mechanism in the African Union, UNECA, and different things like that. There are also a growing amount of concerns being raised on the international scene from the likes of the G77, who are looking at how climate is integrated into credit rating methodologies, and also from different countries who are urging a more considerate and transparent approach to rating credit. We review some of these requests and some of these claims, but then we lead into what is probably the most important part of the paper, where we really translate and articulate what are the systemic levers that are preventing progression, and we highlight two. The first is that if you look at a private creditor, you have to understand their constitution. So a private creditor is defined and essentially controlled by what is called the principal agent relationship. Most private creditors who lend to the continent are what are known as non-bank institutional investors. And that could be things like pension funds, insurance companies, and what have you. Those companies are usually deploying the resources of somebody else, i.e., their principal. So it could be pension holders or investees. Because of that, they have a number of legal constraints that really constrain what the asset manager can do. And they are things like fiduciary duties, they have consumer protection laws in almost every country they operate. And what that means is that they have both fiduciary responsibilities and investment return expectations, which means they really can't afford to and are legally obliged, excuse me, not to restructure. They can't restructure because they're potentially going to take a loss on their investment. At the same time, the second lever is actually the legal framework that operates around the credit rating agencies. So if you have read any of my work, if you've been familiar with what I do, I am certainly no fan or supporter of the big three credit rating agencies. But it is worth noting that they do have a legal framework around them that prevents them from being flexible. The application of legal liability onto credit rating agencies post-financial crisis essentially means that if they were to allow a private creditor to be exposed to the potential of loss, that private creditor could apply liability to that credit rating agency. With the amount of money that we're talking about, it could be absolutely critical and um, essentially could take the credit rating agencies out of business. And this is one of the reasons why they don't um, allow for restructure. And that's why we see the DSSI essentially only achieve half of its objective, and the common framework has only had 4 applicants, 3 who are in default and 1 who is unrated. It essentially means if you are on the rating scale, you cannot restructure and therefore you cannot take part in the G20's programs. This is one of the issues that we talk about in the paper, which is essentially old, antiquated debt treatment programs are no longer suitable or applicable to the modern world in which we live. The paper then moves forward to understand some of the potential ideas for change that are being put forward. And we review some that are looking at maybe increasing transparency by making credit rating agencies declare what information they're using more. You also have different studies where the aim is to maybe increase how a credit rating agency and when it releases data. Also, there are requests for them to publish scenario tests so that we can see how their credit ratings really survive under particular stress tests. And then also requests for things like a global super regulator to enhance standards, to increase training standards, and to allow for countries in the global south to have a better influence and impact on how credit rating agencies operate. However, and the last thing I'll mention there is that there's also a real focus on a credit rating agency's time horizon. And by time horizon, we essentially mean how far into the future does the credit rating agency consider the risk they're looking at. The suggestion is in one paper, specifically from UNDESA, is that a credit rating agency really shouldn't rate a product or an issuance if it goes longer than their own time horizon. So really, they shouldn't be rating euro bonds that have a 10-year maturity rate if their time horizon window only stretches to 2 to 3 years. The issue with that is that you could potentially kill the euro bond market because euro bonds tend to operate on 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So on top of that, we then move forward to showcase some of the excellent things going on. We do not look at private credit rating agencies on the ground, although it is worth noting that the increasing focus on the ground is certainly positive. Sovereign African ratings is certainly part of that of that growth, absolutely, as well as other things on the ground that are happening, particularly in Mauritius and places like that. So we don't cover that, but it is worth noting. What we do cover is the formulation of the prospective public credit rating agency within the African Union that is being developed, and we discuss what that will look like and what its potential could be. We discussed that its potential really isn't going to be in challenging the big three, unfortunately, but what its potential does lie in is providing a different viewpoint and also potentially participating in growing in the domestic space on the continent. So that is aiding domestic credit rating agencies like SAR, but also encouraging the growth of things like SME ratings and growing the SME space on the African continent, which is critical considering the amount of SMEs that are active on the African continent. We also look at the BRICS public CRA initiative, which is potentially being redeveloped after the first phase of failure. And then we look at some of the things that are happening on the ground in terms of what I believe to be and what I am really channeling my focus into, which is the critical importance of capacity building measures. We look at what happens within the APRM and the capacity building they do, which has been the most extensive. UNDP Africa has just launched a new credit rating initiative, which essentially injects capacity building into particular countries and essentially allows them to gain external experienced access to former analysts for no fee. It's a pilot at the moment, but at the moment it's actually taken off and is having a large impact. We also look at the African Capacity Building Foundation, as well as the African Legal Support Facility. So we showcase these initiatives to show why they're important. And for me personally, this is my focus because I do believe essentially what we have is African countries have been encouraged and essentially forced into a system that they do not have the relevant experience for. And that is not the fault of the African countries at all. To resolve that, essentially what we're suggesting is that capacity building measures can inject what they need and speed up their process to get to a point where they're able and have the tools to cope in the capital markets within which they sit. The capital markets are very extensive and established, and you need a particular certain set of skills to cope adequately within those new environments. So essentially, that is the paper. The paper finishes with 3 particular recommendations, which I will share with you now. The first is that one thing that we saw in the UNU paper, which looked at the request of the Global South, was that representation was a critical component. In the credit rating field, you don't have a global regulator, so it's difficult to have representation on the global space. But what we do have is something which is essentially the best way to describe it is a starting pistol of regulation. So, for example, in the United States, in the European Union, it takes so much capital to start a new regulation that they usually have to be encouraged and to be shown why it's important. And that starting pistol is the International Organization of Securities Commissions, also known as IOSCO. In IOSCO, which is a global body, you have a subcommittee, which is Committee 6, and that is solely focused on credit rating agencies. Now, I produced this map to show you on the screen where the particular members of the committee sit. And as you can see, hopefully in the room, there is a glaring gap. There is not one representative from the African continent on that committee. So what we suggest in this paper is this is the lowest hanging fruit, that really this should be the first role, the first change that we see take place, which is African representation on this committee. We suggest in the paper that it would naturally be South Africa, given that the big 3 are housed within South Africa alone, but it could also be somebody from the African Union. With South Africa's regulatory framework being the most extensive and well maintained within the continent, it makes sense for South Africa to sit on that panel, and talks are underway to get that to happen. The second recommendation is that if you are to look on the public credit rating methodologies of the big 3, they tell you very much in passing the types of data they will use when they conduct a credit rating. What we suggest is that every credit rating that is produced should have a list of all the public data they have used for that particular credit rating. That would increase transparency and allow countries, particularly within Africa and the Global South, to better understand how they are being rated. We discussed that here. And then the final recommendation is more of a call to arms, less of a recommendation, but it is to confirm something which I have discussed for quite a while, but others have discussed as well. It is absolutely critical that we get to a point where we have African continental regulation. Continental regulation is the only way you can constrain the big three credit rating agencies. And the best example, though we don't encourage Africa to follow Europe's footstep every time, but the EU is a great example. Within 4 years after the crisis, they went from no regulation to the most extensive regulatory framework that exists on the planet. And a lot of the things that are happening in the African continent now, like credit rating agencies not putting the right amount of analyst on a country's rating, credit rating agencies speaking to the press before something gets published, all of these things essentially are illegal in the European Union. And in order to help African countries get a fairer crack of the whip, we're suggesting that it is only African continental rating regulation that can allow that to happen. So, in a nutshell, that is our paper. I'm hoping that the technical issues have been resolved enough so maybe there's questions, but I'm happy to answer anything that comes through. Thank you for your time.